let's talk about a law that basically hit the pause button on our shared culture for 2 whole decades. And it all happened because of a few extremely famous and, yeah, extremely valuable creative works. And that really gets to the heart of the matter. It sounds like a joke, right? Why on earth did a cartoon mouse from 1928 need a whole act of Congress 70 years later? Well, the answer pulls back the curtain on this huge battle over art, money, and what all of us, as a culture, actually get to own. And that whole fight really kicks off with what a lot of people started calling the Mickey Mouse problem. But honestly, it was a problem that was way, way bigger than just one cartoon character. Okay, so to really get what was at stake here, we have to be clear on one crucial idea: the public domain. The best way to think about it is like a giant free library of human creativity. Once a work lands in the public domain, its copyright is gone. It doesn't belong to one person or one company anymore. It belongs to all of us, to use, to adapt, to remix, and to build on, completely for free. And in the late 1990s, that clock was ticking down loud. Some of the biggest cultural touchstones of the 1920s were about to go public. We're talking about the earliest version of Mickey Mouse from Steamboat Willie, George Gershwin's incredible Rhapsody in Blue. For the companies and estates that owned these cash cows, this wasn't a moment for celebration. It was a terrifying deadline. So, with literally billions of dollars on the line, a plan was hatched. And the plan wasn't to meet the deadline, it was to move the entire finish line. And that solution came in the form of the Sonny Bono Copyright Term Extension Act of 1998. Now, its official purpose was to update U.S. copyright law. But let's be real, its connection to Disney's intense lobbying was so obvious that opponents immediately gave it a nickname that stuck: the Mickey Mouse Protection Act. So what did this law actually change? It's pretty simple, but the impact was huge. Before, for an individual creator, copyright lasted for their entire life plus 50 years. The new law bumped that up to life plus 70 years. And for corporate works like, Mickey Mouse, the term jumped from 75 years to a whopping 95 years, a 20-year extension across the board. This timeline really puts it into perspective. That 1998 act created what you could call a 20-year cultural freeze. For 2 decades, nothing new entered the public domain because of an expiring copyright. The flow of culture just stopped. It only started up again in 2019, and that's why we're only now, in 2024, seeing things from 1928, like Steamboat Willie, finally become public property. Now, as you can probably guess, a law this massive wasn't passed without a serious fight, which brings us to the arguments that were flying around during this great copyright debate. It really boiled down to these key points. On one side, supporters said, hey, we need to match Europe's laws, which are already life plus 70. They also claimed it would protect America's trade balance and give companies a reason to preserve their old movies and music. But on the other side, opponents were calling it corporate welfare, just a massive handout to a few powerful companies. They argued it went against the whole spirit of the Constitution, which says copyright should only be for limited times, and that it was basically starving the public domain of the raw materials that new creators need. And get this quote from Congresswoman Mary Bono, Sonny Bono's widow, who championed the bill, is just wow. She said it right there on the House floor. The real goal wasn't just another 20 years. They wanted copyright to last forever. The only thing stopping them? The U.S. Constitution. And here's the perfect counterargument. A New York Times editorial from back then framed it beautifully. They said, the public domain isn't some black hole where art goes to die. No, it's a place where works get a second wind, a new life, because they suddenly become available for everyone to build upon. And if you look at who was pushing for this law, it tells you everything you need to know. It was a who's who of entertainment giants. Disney, of course, Time Warner, Universal, the MPAA, even the big sports leagues like the NFL and NBA got on board. Basically, anyone with incredibly valuable intellectual property they wanted to keep locked down for longer. And the opposition? Well, it was a totally different kind of group. You had librarians, archivists, law professors, people who really depend on a healthy public domain. But maybe most importantly, you had a group of 17 top economists, including Nobel Prize winners, who all signed a brief saying the economic upside of this law was tiny compared to the massive cost to the public. The act managed to pass, but the fight was nowhere near over. The battle just moved out of the halls of Congress and into the nation's highest court. Opponents immediately sued. Their argument was that going back and adding 20 years to existing copyrights was unconstitutional. They said it violated the limited times clause. In that case, Eldred versus Ashcroft went all the way to the Supreme Court.
Well, in 2003, the verdict came in. And with a 7-2 vote, the Supreme Court declared that the Copyright Term Extension Act was, in fact, constitutional. The 20-year extension was here to stay.
So why did they uphold it? The court's reasoning basically came down to this. They said the Constitution gives Congress a lot of leeway to decide what limited times actually means. And in their view, while 95 years is definitely a long time, it's not infinite. So they decided it was within Congress's power to set that term.
So the legal fight was over, but the debate definitely wasn't. And in the years that followed the court case, researchers started to look at what the real-world effects of the law actually were. You remember that argument that longer copyrights would encourage companies to preserve their works and keep them available? Well, once the law was a done deal, researchers decided to actually, test that theory with real data. And what one major study found was pretty striking. It turns out that books from the 1880s, which are in the public domain, are available on Amazon at twice the rate of copyrighted books from the 1980s. That kind of suggested that, hey, maybe long copyright terms don't preserve culture. Maybe they actually cause it to disappear from public view.
So when we look back, what's the real legacy of this law? Well, for one, it punched a 20-year hole in our public domain. It gave giant franchises decades of extra protection and profitability. But it also had this unintended side effect. It sparked this whole modern movement of people passionate about defending the public domain. And it forced a huge public conversation about what copyright is even for in the first place.
And that brings us right back to where we started. That 20-year freeze finally ended in 2019. And now, year by year, new things are finally entering our shared cultural library again. And that is exactly why the 1928 version of Mickey Mouse from Steamboat Willie is, at long last, for everybody. But this whole story leaves us with one last really big question for today. That whole fight back in the 90s was about photocopies and VCRs. We now live in an age of generative AI and instant digital remix culture. So what should limited times mean now? How do we find that balance between rewarding creators while also making sure we're feeding the public domain that the next generation of creators is going to need? That's the new fight, and it's one we're all going to have to figure out.